The headline sounds simple: a brief arrest, a quick release, and life goes on. But when you zoom out, this moment quietly connects fame, pressure, timing, and public perception in a way that most people completely miss. Because this isn't just about what reportedly happened late Friday night. It's about who it happened to, when it happened, and why even a minor incident can suddenly reshape a public narrative. And the most interesting part isn't the arrest itself. It's everything surrounding it. According to publicly available reports, award-winning cowboy and professional horse trainer Adan Banuelos was arrested in Texas during the early hours of Saturday morning for public intoxication. The charge itself is classified as a minor offense, and records show that he was released shortly afterward after posting a bond of just under $400. No injuries were reported. No additional charges were listed, and as of now, official details explaining what led to the arrest have not been released. On paper, it looks like a short, uneventful entry in a county jail log. But context changes everything, because just hours earlier, Banuelos had been competing at a major equestrian event, the 4-year-old Open Derby at the Bosque Ranch Winter Bash, a high-profile competition within the cutting horse world. And just weeks earlier, his name had been appearing in an entirely different kind of spotlight. For years, Adan Banuelos built a reputation far away from Hollywood headlines. Within professional equestrian circles, he's known as one of the most successful cutting horse trainers of his generation. He's earned multiple National Cutting Horse Association Open Rider of the Year titles, including wins across several different seasons, and recently surpassed $8 million in lifetime NCHA earnings, a milestone only a handful of riders ever reach. This is a career defined by consistency, discipline, and long-term performance, not controversy. So when his name suddenly began trending outside of equestrian media, it wasn't because of a competition result. It was because of who he was reportedly dating. In late 2023, Banuelos entered the mainstream conversation after being linked to supermodel Bella Hadid. The relationship, while never heavily documented by either party, quickly drew attention simply because it bridged two very different worlds: high fashion and professional rodeo sports. For Banuelos, that meant something important changed overnight. His actions were no longer being noticed only by fans of the sport. They were now being observed, interpreted, and sometimes magnified by a global audience unfamiliar with his background. And according to recent reports, the relationship had already ended earlier this month, which makes the timing of this incident notable. Not dramatic, not scandalous, just notable. Public incidents don't exist in a vacuum. A minor offense that might otherwise pass quietly can take on new meaning depending on timing, especially when someone has recently been in the public spotlight. That doesn't mean conclusions should be drawn, and it doesn't mean motives should be assumed, but it does explain why a routine police record suddenly became entertainment news. As of now, neither Banuelos nor local authorities have released further details, and media outlets have noted that requests for comment have not yet received responses. So what we're left with is not a complete story, but an unfinished one. And that's where things get interesting. This moment highlights a broader pattern seen again and again with individuals who move from niche excellence into mainstream visibility. For years, Banuelos' reputation was shaped almost entirely by results, rankings, and earnings. Now, even a small, reportedly non-violent incident becomes part of a public narrative that stretches far beyond his profession. Not because of the severity, but because of visibility. And once that shift happens, perception starts moving faster than facts. So the real question isn't what happened that night. The real question is what happens after a moment like this. When attention fades, headlines move on and reputations quietly adjust. Because history shows that these moments rarely matter for the reasons people think they do. And the next part of this story reveals why. When a story like this breaks, the facts usually stay the same. But the framing doesn't. In this case, publicly available information points to a brief arrest, a minor charge, and a release within hours. That's the entire confirmed sequence. Yet the way audiences experience the story depends almost entirely on the lens through which it's presented. For equestrian fans, this might register as a footnote. For entertainment media readers, it becomes a celebrity-adjacent headline. And for the general public, it's often reduced to a Single sentence, stripped of context, background, and proportion. This is where perception begins to drift away from reality. Not through misinformation, but through compression. Psychologists and media analysts often point out that audiences naturally assign meaning based on patterns, not isolated facts. So when a name becomes recognizable, even a minor event can feel symbolic. Even if it isn't. In Banuelos' case, several elements converged at once. Recent mainstream attention, a reported breakup, a competitive event earlier that same day, and an arrest record that, under normal circumstances, would barely circulate individually. None of these elements imply anything unusual. But combined, they create a moment that invites speculation, even when speculation isn't supported by evidence. That's not a flaw in reporting. It's a feature of modern attention cycles. And here's where most people get it wrong. They assume moments like this define careers, but historically they almost never do. If you look at similar cases across sports, entertainment, and public life, a consistent pattern emerges. Minor nonviolent incidents, especially those resolved quickly and without escalation, tend to fade unless they're followed by additional events. In other words, the long-term impact is rarely determined by the incident itself. It's determined by what comes next. For professionals like Banuelos, whose reputation is built on measurable performance rather than public persona, outcomes typically depend on continued competition results, public behavior moving forward, and whether the individual remains focused on their core profession. So far, there's no public indication that this incident has affected any of those factors, and that distinction matters. One detail that often goes unnoticed is what hasn't happened. As of now, there has been no public statement, no extended explanation, and no attempt to control the narrative. That silence can mean many things, and it's important not to assign intent. But in media strategy terms, silence is often used when the facts are straightforward. The issue is limited in scope, and responding would give the story more momentum than it already has. In many cases, allowing a minor story to pass without amplification is the most effective way to reduce its lifespan. And statistically, that approach tends to work. Which leads to a more interesting question. Why do stories like this capture attention even when they don't actually change anything? At its core, this story taps into something familiar: the collision between private moments and public visibility. When someone crosses from a specialized world into mainstream awareness, everyday situations suddenly feel larger. Not because they are, but because more people are watching. It's not about judgment. It's about contrast. A disciplined, highly structured professional life on one side, and an unscripted human moment on the other. That contrast is compelling, even when the outcome is uneventful. So let's draw a clean line. What we know: a reported arrest for public intoxication, a quick release after posting bond, no additional charges publicly listed, no confirmed details about what led up to the incident. What we don't know: the specific circumstances, any personal context, any long-term consequences. And without that information, responsible reporting stops short of interpretation, which is exactly where this story currently stands. But there's still one layer left to examine, because stories like this don't end with facts. They end with memory. And what people remember is often very different from what actually happened. When stories like this surface, they tend to live in two very different places. There's the factual record, dates, charges, outcomes, and then there's public memory, which works very differently. Public memory doesn't store full timelines. It stores impressions. Over time, details blur, headlines fade, and what remains is often a simplified version that lacks scale or proportion. That's why moments that are objectively minor can feel larger in retrospect. Not because they mattered more, but because they were noticed more. And that distinction is crucial. Reputations aren't shaped by isolated incidents. They're shaped by patterns. For professionals whose careers depend on performance, consistency tends to outweigh momentary attention, especially when there's no ongoing issue, escalation, or unresolved question. In Banuelos' case, his public record remains overwhelmingly defined by years of competitive success, not by a single reported incident that resolved quickly. History shows that unless attention is repeatedly reinforced, it naturally moves on. And most of the time, it does so quietly. Which brings us to something rarely discussed. Why moments like this feel important now, but almost irrelevant later. Modern media operates in short attention windows. A story peaks, circulates, and then gets replaced, sometimes within hours. What determines how long it lasts isn't the severity of the event, but whether new information continues to emerge. And in this case, there's been no expanding narrative, no follow-ups, no escalating details, no broader implications. That usually signals an ending, even if the headline lingers a bit longer. One of the reasons this story remains relatively contained is the language used to describe it. Words like reportedly, according to records, and no further details available act as guardrails, not to minimize, but to contextualize. That kind of language doesn't remove accountability. It simply prevents assumption from outrunning information. And in an era of instant reactions, that restraint matters more than ever. So if this moment doesn't define a career, what does it actually tell us? It tells us that visibility changes scale, that the same action can feel different depending on how many eyes are watching, and that public attention often says more about cultural curiosity than personal character. This isn't a story about downfall or drama. It's a story about how quickly narratives form and how quietly they dissolve. Understanding moments like this requires stepping back rather than leaning in, looking at timelines instead of headlines, patterns instead of pauses. If you want a clearer picture of how visibility reshapes careers without defining them, that's where the story continues.